presenter is Jack DuVall, who's the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, as Dominic mentioned. He's also the co-author of the book, A Force More Powerful, and was one of the brains behind turning it into the documentary series. And so he's been running ICNC for 10 years now.
8 years.
8 years now. And leading various educational projects and initiatives on this topic. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jack DuVall.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Before I do anything else, I wanted to introduce formally our Senior Director for Education and Research, Maciej Barkowski. You heard him speak before, but I wanted to make sure that he was actually formally and properly introduced. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. I speak not only on behalf of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which, by the way, is a private, independent, self-funded operating organization. I'll tell you a little bit more about the center in a moment. But it's also a pleasure to be here again at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where we have long-standing relationships. USIP, within its body of fellows and research associates, and in its publishing and educational activities, is an institution that took very early cognizance of civil resistance. And in fact, the very first activity that ICNC ever engaged in when it was organized in January of 2002 was to immediately go on a retreat, which was co-hosted by the U.S. Institute of Peace and aggregated dissidents from around the world and people who've been involved in the study of civil resistance and nonviolent action, including Gene Sharp himself. It was sort of a miscellaneous group in terms of people's backgrounds, and things were on the record, and the field was discussed in order to supply ideas to this new organization as we began to organize ourselves. The organization was put together in part because of the enormous demand for more knowledge about how to take up the use of nonviolent resistance in the wake of the television series and the book, A Force More Powerful, which I spent a good deal of my time after those two things came out in 2000, running around the world talking about and promoting the use of. And then Peter Ackerman and I decided that we needed an organization, a regular, nonprofit, conventional organization, to help promote the knowledge and study of the phenomenon, which we had reduced to a book and a television series. Peter Ackerman is someone who's been at this work for more than 40 years, almost 40 years, having written his dissertation at the Fletcher School at Tufts on civil resistance, aspects of it, back in the 1970s. The study of this, as you'll hear from me shortly, has been going on for a very long time, but it really is only cresting in its effect, I think, globally, it's fair to say, in recent years. And this, of course, is one of the many manifestations of that. And talk to Maciej if you'd like to hear more about the other things we're doing educationally around the world. I said I'd tell you a little bit more about the organization. We are a private operating foundation under U.S. laws. We are a nonprofit foundation. We are prohibited from accepting money from any more than one funder, and that funder is Peter Ackerman's family philanthropy. That means we cannot accept money from any government, including the U.S. government, or any other foundation, or any other private individuals, which is to say they can't influence us by deciding to support X, Y, or Z. We get to decide on our own what we're going to do. And all of our money has to be spent every year on the specific stated purposes of the organization, which are educational. And the people who are interested in getting educated and who therefore we do educate are organizers and activists, people who want to use civil resistance in all kinds of political, social, and economic conflicts, individuals who are in civil society around the world, may work for NGOs or INGOs, may work for local groups, human rights organizations, organizations which are attempting to defend human rights in some form or another, very typical of that group of people who are quite interested in this knowledge. People in journalism and in the media who have to write stories about this, and then people in the policy world who may be in a position to influence the development of policy, which then in turn influences the phenomenon. Sometimes I joke that if we sit down and explain the core dynamic of civil resistance to an individual from each of these four groups, and I'll be explaining that core dynamic to you in a few minutes, if we do that, instead of we explain it to an organizer and activist, it takes them about 5 minutes to get the essence of what the real dynamic is in this form of political action. If we take the ordinary academic, be he or her a political scientist or sociologist or economist, and sit that person down and explain it to them, it takes them about 5 hours to really get the essence of the core dynamic. If we sit down a policymaker or a policy advisor, someone sitting in a think tank, and explain it to them, it takes them about 5 days to really be able to get the basic core dynamic down. And if we try to explain this to a journalist, it takes them about 5 weeks to really, and that obviously has nothing to do with the intelligence of the person that we're talking with. It has to do with how hardened the default ideas are about the way the world works. And that's the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about for a few minutes before I go directly into the presentation itself. There are 3 ways to look at the phenomena of civil resistance, just as there are these same 3 ways to look at virtually any political or social phenomenon, and I put them right here on this chart. It's possible to look at any form of political, social, or economic phenomenon from the perspective of and trying to explain the influence of state actors, an academic expression meaning governments. But much of academic and policy discourse, and therefore much of what you hear from news sources, has to do with what governments do. So state actors. People who participate in movements and campaigns using civil resistance are non-state actors. The dominance of looking at the world from the perspective of state actors tends to marginalize discussion of what non-state actors are doing. We're going to move you from state actors to non-state actors in order to be able to understand this phenomenon. When I gave you my little examples of the time it took for policy people and journalists, it's because they're focusing on state actors all the time. It takes them an effort to get over here to look at it from the perspective of non-state actors. Another perspective or grid from which to look at this or other phenomena is, and now I'm using strictly academic terms, from the perspective of structures in societies or communities that supposedly house or are locations for the exercise of power, rather than looking at how power is exercised, and who's exercising it, which is to say, agency. Who are the agents whereby power is actually exercised, instead of assuming that structures embody power, and in order to understand power, you have to look at structures. But it's no accident that people preoccupied with state actors are going to be preoccupied with structure at the same time. So here again, we're going to try to move you from looking at this phenomenon from whatever you've learned about the supposed dominance of structure in explaining political, social, and economic phenomena to the perspective of agency. And the third way of looking at it is much simpler but equally important, which is to say, instead of looking at phenomena from the perspective of all the people who write the literature, which is elites, instead of looking at this phenomenon from a top-down perspective, we're going to try to move the discussion to looking at these phenomena from the, whoops. Okay, there we go. Where did you have this?
Just to make sure.
Techie, I'm not. We're going to try to move you to the perspective of bottom up. If you look at everything that we tell you with respect to civil resistance in terms of the potential power available to non-state actors, looking at the agency that they exercise, looking at them as agents on their own behalf, and look then, particularly when they organize in terms of campaigns and movements, what they're doing at, American term, the grassroots of the societies in which they operate, you'll be much more likely to understand the nature of the power that they are able to produce from their activities. And it's those activities that we call civil resistance. Now, I gave this talk to a public sociology class a couple of weeks ago out of George Mason University, and that class was begun by one of our academic advisors, who's a sociologist, a guy who understands this field very well, And he had taken a video from a Moodle for another public sociology class posted by the teacher of that class who wanted to introduce people to public sociology. And he covered lots of interesting ideas during that process. But I began to detect a little bit of structure, a lot of structure in what that guy was saying, and then a lot of top-down as well. And so then I graphed his remarks, and I found that he used the term micro, macro, and micro. And he kept talking about institutions as if they were at the macro level. And he kept talking about what happened here as influencing what happened down here at the micro level. And he talked about institutions, and then he talked about people down here. So people tend to be on the receiving end of what institutions do. And so I put up this little graph for the class, and I said, what my talk is about is what these people do to influence this, directly, to influence macroeconomic, political, social, and economic events. You don't have to go through institutions if you understand civil resistance. That's why we're interested in people power. And that's why the term people power is not just a popular expression, it actually means something. So civil resistance, which we regard as a historically emerging force for rights, and as well, and this is one of the reasons why many NGOs and international institutions are newly interested in civil resistance, it is an alternative to violence as a form of political change. One of the first thinkers and writers who understood this phenomenon innately was Frederick Douglass, the great African-American leader of the movement to abolish slavery before, during, and somewhat after the American Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. And this statement contains some of what are still the core ideas necessary to understand to be able to learn civil resistance. He said, power concedes nothing. It really means, in that sense, by power, those who are possessing power, those who are using power. He then is, in fact, talking about structure and institutions. Power concedes nothing, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you will have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them. In other words, he's saying, unless people refuse to allow themselves to have power imposed upon them, that will happen to them. So resistance is a requirement for free action, is what he is indirectly saying by saying that. And then these abuses that the power holders are perpetuating are going to continue. They're going to continue until they're resisted. You can't wait for them suddenly to stop. I'll come back, in like 2 years and see if, they're still abusing me. Those abuses will continue. This was a very cynical and negative view of the inclinations of those who hold unchallenged power. It's no surprise that it came from someone who had been a slave, was freed, and then worked for the rest of his life to free the rest of his people from slavery, and saw that moment happen, at least legally and constitutionally. So then he concludes the limits of tyrants, those who would take freedom away from people, are prescribed, are set by the endurance of those whom they oppress. This idea right here was strongly represented in his remarks throughout his career by Mohandas Gandhi, who kept reminding first South Africans and then Indians that, shocking formulation, they were partly responsible for their own conditions. But that also meant that they could take responsibility for their own conditions and had to evaluate the action that they could take which might actually free them. About a half century after Frederick Douglass, Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, who also had an avocation as a vigilant opponent of conscription, not exactly a successful cause in Tsarist Russia, opposing the drafting of people into the Tsar's army. He said in one of his philosophical comments on the opportunity of ordinary people to resist abuses of power such as conscription, he said that at one day in human history, public opinion would change the entire structure of life, not just politics and government and institutions and rights, the entire structure of life, and that would make violence superfluous. Superfluous. He didn't, not odious or morally repugnant, which violence may be in many of its uses, but simply superfluous. Now, Tolstoy's understanding of public opinion was something other than what you get if you go door to door and ask people who they're going to vote for. By public opinion, he meant the mass of opinion and will and awareness and recognition and understanding in the society that could motivate people collectively to take action, and that form of public opinion would have such an impact once individuals were liberated to be able to exercise the power that already belonged to them. That would change the structure of the way in which people lived and would therefore make violence, which is an instrumentality of action, unnecessary or superfluous. This is the guy, Mohandas Gandhi, who applied these ideas more comprehensively and systematically up to that point in human history than anyone had before. And after he campaigned on behalf of people of color in South Africa in the first decade of the 20th century, when he had a very active correspondence with Tolstoy, he returned to his native India, at one point commenting that he had been overwhelmed by Tolstoy's thinking, but Gandhi was also very much influenced by what he read in South African and Indian newspapers about the Irish resistance to British rule, particularly rent strikes, which he found to be a fascinating tactic. He thought strategically, he thought tactically. And he also was quite influenced by the coverage of the 1905 Russian Revolution, which Tolstoy observed, which was largely nonviolent until the Bolsheviks decided to turn it into a violent insurrection on the streets in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is another story. But those cases, you'll see in the history of civil resistance that a particular well-covered and well-reported movement or campaign in which civil resistance is being used will influence the action that takes place in a subsequent struggle. Gandhi's campaigns in India greatly influenced the thinking of African American leaders who would 10, 20 years later begin to apply some of those ideas and practices in the American civil rights movement in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. The impact of Gandhi's campaigns of non-cooperation and civil disobedience was so great, and as we know, he was resisting British control of India, which was maintained by the British Empire, that he influenced the thinking of this member of the British foreign policy establishment, who concluded at one point in the mid-1930s that England could hold India only by consent. We can't rule it by the sword. He saw the essence of what Gandhi was trying to do, which was to persuade Indians to withdraw their consent from British rule of India. Gandhi's central proposition to the Indian people, which is reflected in so many of the things that he said, and by the way, the language, the discourse of leaders and participants in movements and campaigns is itself a mechanism for change, not simply tactical mobilization, as I hope you'll see during the course of what you'll be through with us during this course. But this withdrawal of consent would delegitimize the nature of the way in which power was exercised. It would delegitimize the exercise of power because it would show that those over whom power was being wielded had come to the decision that that exercise of power wasn't benefiting them, which would in fact refute what the state would always be saying, which is, we're helping you, we're doing the best we can, just wait, trust us, we'll exercise power on your own behalf, which was of course what the British Raj said about India. This concept of consent is one of the most important ideas to understand in order to be able to understand the way in which civil resistance works strategically. But it wasn't simply strategy, it was also tactics, And Gandhi's nonviolent weapons, by the way, a phrase he himself used, probably invented, I don't know of any earlier use of that phrase, was through tactics like mass marches and protests, getting people to refuse to pay taxes or fees, boycotts of products that were manufactured or sold by the state, resignations by Indians from local administrative offices, and then active interference and disruption with the operations of the state. One of the reasons why these tactics are used is because they are disruptive. The famous American academic Gene Sharp, who wrote most voluminously about the politics of nonviolent action in the 1950s and 1960s, categorized about 200 nonviolent tactics in this way, suggesting that there were tactics of protest and persuasion, like symbols and vigils and walkouts, tactics of non-cooperation with those who hold power, boycott, strike, sit-ins, civil disobedience itself, and then the more disruptive tactics of intervention, blockades, and seizures. You'll see different ways of categorizing nonviolent tactics, but it's important to understand that these are the actions that people organized in some form employ to exhibit their withdrawal of consent from the system to which they are objecting. There are other strategic purposes for using certain tactics, but fundamentally, the development of a strategy in a nonviolent movement or campaign is for the purpose of changing the way in which power is exercised in the society in order to be able to begin to shift the locations of power and in order to be able eventually to change the system itself. So the dynamic of civil resistance as I see it is this. When people deprive an oppressor, the Indians depriving the British Raj of their consent, the legitimacy of the system goes down, which creates a political problem for the state. When enough people refuse to cooperate, the cost of holding control, physical control, economic control, administrative control, control through law enforcement agencies, that cost goes up. Can you undertake tactics which don't raise the cost and waste your time? Yes, you can. That's the importance of strategic thinking. Can you find tactics which do a better job of increasing cost without increasing your risk of having something unfortunate happen to you? Yes, you can. That's also part of strategic thinking in a campaign or a movement. And so when both of these things happen, when the system's legitimacy goes down and the costs go up, suddenly everybody who's living within the system, including the people who are enforcing the system itself, begin to think, you know, this isn't exactly working out the way it used to. You know, we're working overtime, we're having to do a lot of things, it's a lot harder to maintain the system than it used to be. You're putting pressure on a system which people already in the society are discontent about. To silent discontent, you are adding an active element, not simply the exhibition through protest of discontent, but through protest and other forms of nonviolent tactics that actually make those who are maintaining the system pay specific costs. Is there an economic model for civil resistance? Yes. Has that actually been well developed yet? No, because this is still an historically emerging field of study in the social sciences. That's one of the avenues of thinking that still has yet to be fully explored. We've got a lot of tactical knowledge. We have a good core of strategic, dynamic knowledge about how campaigns and movements work, but there are lots and lots of issues and ideas that need additional attention so that this record can continue. This is really an extraordinary record of what nation-changing nonviolent movements have accomplished in the last 80, 90 years, going back a long way. The Indian campaign for independence in the 1920s through 1940s. In El Salvador, a wonderful one-month general strike which removed a dictator who had resisted removal through violent insurrection. In 1944, the rise of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. The long simmering campaign of protest and resistance to the military junta in Argentina in the 1970s and early 1980s, the slow developing but finally successful movement to remove the dictator Augusto Pinochet from the presidency of Chile in the 1980s, the rise of solidarity in Poland against the authoritarian communist regime in that country, which was ultimately successful in the late 1980s, the so-called People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s, the successful change in governments in East Germany, largely through civilian-based protests and actions in that country in 1989, the largely unremarked upon, but really rather extraordinary and entirely peaceful and electoral change from authoritarianism to democracy in Mongolia in 1990. Guess what the big tactic was there that surprised the government and stopped them in their tracks? Does anybody know anything about Mongolia? Fasting. Fasting was the culturally resonant tactic which stumped the Mongolian Politburo and probably made them hesitate about repression long enough to allow some other things to be done to move the movement down the road toward the change there. The resistance to the attempted coup against Gorbachev and Yeltsin in 1991, in which tens of thousands of mostly Muscovites participated. The long-running movement against apartheid in South Africa, which used through the United Democratic Front and through labor unions a number of different kinds of nonviolent tactics to raise the cost of the apartheid state and helped to drive that transition. And then, of course, the famous and probably misnamed color revolutions in Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine in 2000, 2003, and 2004. I say misnamed because I don't think they were really revolutions. They certainly were electoral transitions that were abetted by organizing and mobilizing in civil society to produce protests when questionable elections were held. So this is the history. Another way of looking at this history is this way. In the 35 years between 1970 and 2005, according to an exhaustive study by Freedom House, there were 67 transitions. This is just the big nation-changing changes of regime from authoritarian to democratic movements. And in 50 of those 67 transitions, some form of nonviolent, coalitional, civil society-based force was employed at some determining moment or in some determining phase of the life of a campaign or a movement within these 50 societies in this 35-year period of time. So that gives you a somewhat more modern frame for looking at the impact of civil resistance. It doesn't always work, or it's not always used effectively. There are risks in making choices which have a strategic effect. A strategic effect can be negative. Not all strategic effects are positive. Tiananmen was, in the modern period, the most well-reported, extremely bloody example of repression used successfully to effectively snuff out a budding civilian-based campaign of political protest and dissent. And the explanation for why it didn't succeed is suggested in part, I think, from this quote from the old Chinese military sage Sun Tzu, who said, "Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat." In this case, the students who organized, and they were fabulous organizers and mobilizers, managed to attract 500,000 people to Tiananmen Square. Perhaps 700,000 or 800,000. There is still differences of opinion. There are still differences of opinion about the numbers that were present there. Managed to force the regime to negotiate with them. The regime wanted them dispersed. The moderates in the Politburo, as the Tiananmen papers later revealed, wanted to be able to negotiate a deal so that they would just quietly go away and there wouldn't be what actually happened. The hardliners wanted to do what they actually succeeded in doing, which is what you see depicted in this photograph. The students didn't recognize They weren't professional negotiators. They hadn't been through a workshop on how to negotiate with authoritarian regimes. I don't want to make light of these events, but this negotiation at one point, part of it was broadcast on national television. Can you imagine that even today in China? This campaign was so successful that it forced the Chinese leaders to go on national television with them and discuss what their demands were in the context of 500,000 people sitting a kilometer or two away in Tiananmen Square. The student leaders refused to back down from their maximum demands, were probably unaware that they were having this effect. They were unable to offer any hope to the moderates in the internal deliberations. The hardliners won that debate, and this is what happened. The Poles followed a different trajectory at various stages of the unfoldment of the Solidarity movement. So if you haven't seen either the 30-minute segment on the rise of Solidarity in the A Force More Powerful television series or the chapter in the book A Force More Powerful, I would suggest you do that, because you will find out that the leaders of Solidarity had a quite different approach to dealing with an equally nasty regime. Threatened with its existence, all authoritarian regimes, however light or heavy they seem to be, are going to be very nasty at that moment when their power is existentially challenged. And that's the nastiness. So, but the triumphs, historically, of people power have been very useful. The record that I've been talking about of all these other successful campaigns and movements has been very successful in exhibiting to the world that this is a form of power, that this is a way to change history, that this is a way to move societies, and as these phenomena of strategies and tactics and civil resistance can be utilized at a lower level in societies, a way in which communities of people, the way in which problems at a subnational level can also be addressed. This isn't a methodology only of regime change. I suspect that if this workshop were being held 20 years from now, we'd look back at another 40 or 50 campaigns, and most of those would be at the subnational level. There might be another dozen at the national level, but there would be probably scores of successful campaigns that had happened engaged in other kinds of struggles, which I'll mention too in a moment. In looking at campaigns and movements, it's become apparent to me that the use of civil resistance by a popular movement doesn't simply produce certain strategic effects, which leads to a shift in power in the society or a negotiation and a withdrawal of the abuses or the sources of discontent. Something changes in the society and in the polity that makes it, on the margin, somewhat less difficult to successfully sustain power from the bottom up rather than from the top down. In other words, there are emergent properties within the body politic, within the society, from the use of civil resistance. And some of those I'm going to tell you about right now. One of them is this idea of consent. The idea, particularly if it's suggested explicitly by leaders of campaigns and movements, that by engaging in a protest, you are saying that's not right, and so I'm withdrawing my consent. I'm saying that's not legitimate, so I'm withdrawing my consent from that feature of the way power is exercised. Or maybe I'm withdrawing my consent from everything about the way in which power is exercised in my society. This means that the people themselves are those who decide what's legitimate, what kind of exercise of power in the society is legitimate. This means that in order for a president to rule in a democracy, a majority has to vote for that president. That confers the legitimacy on that president's exercise of power. Changes the idea of the way power should be used and where power comes from within the society. It also shows people that they have space in which to take action. How many democracies are there in the world today in which 30, 40% of the people don't vote. 30 or 40% of the people don't vote in this society. There's plenty of space in which to take civic action or resist, but it's underutilized for reasons that we don't have time to go into right now. This idea that my consent matters, what I say, what I give my assent to, or what I refuse to give my assent to, itself has political power. That makes it easier than 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, to convince people that they have a stake in what's going on in the society. For movements to be organized, leaders have to present propositions to people about what the movement stands for, where we're going, what our vision of tomorrow is, and what's our strategy to get there. Why is this going to be effective? If we take risks and we use all these different kinds of tactics, why are we going to succeed? This models the use of reason. You cannot force people to join a nonviolent movement. It's voluntary. You have to persuade them. So that respects the individual citizen's mind. Just think about that. If that's passed through into the bloodstream of politics in the reset society, the idea that we're respecting what people think because I'm taking the trouble to try to persuade you to follow me becomes ingested, if you will, by the body politic. This also stimulates creative thinking by leaders. How do I persuade these people? As well as by people, I have to break down what this leader has told me. Does this make any sense? It helps critical thinking within the civil society. And as I said, it's based on persuasion, not coercion. It also, this I think is tremendously important, when you do people the honor of giving them an argument about why they should follow you, you have to be seen to be sincere about it. The best way to be sincere is to be honest. Because if you're not honest, a certain percentage of people are going to be able to detect that you're not honest. Honesty builds credibility. If democratic leaders aren't credible, they clearly cannot govern a society whose people's consent they need for their legitimacy. This also instills reasons to believe in the system itself. So it's not simply reducible to, am I getting a chicken in my pot every week? Do I believe in the whole society and the way it's put together? A successful democratic transition can bring this out as an emergent property in the society. Gandhi said to the Indians, when campaigns would become unruly and chaotic, he would call campaigns off, he'd go back and he would say, no, I'm calling this campaign off. We have some of this fringe violence, it's not going to work. And they would say, but we have all this momentum. And he would say, no. Because he says, if we cannot rule our own action, if I cannot rule myself, if you cannot rule yourself, we cannot rule this nation. The Hindu word for self-rule being Swaraj, which equally applies to the individual or to the nation as a whole. So he said, we have to go back to the villages and dig latrines. And people would say, what does that have to do with resisting the British? He said, it has everything to do with resisting the British. Because we're not going to be capable of resisting the British unless we can control our own action, unless we can produce better conditions in the realities of our life. Constructive work, self-organization. Instead of waiting for somebody else to organize, I have to be an active participant in this, planning ahead. Can't have a strategy unless you're able to plan ahead. And then you have to remain nonviolent, because if you don't remain nonviolent, you won't be able to capture legitimacy, because legitimacy is spoiled in most cases, in most insurrectionary, even nonviolent insurrectionary cases, by the use of violence. But the discipline part of this is as important as the nonviolent part of nonviolent discipline. So these values of action, taking responsibility for oneself, are passed into, or can be passed into, the resulting society. You also can't organize movements unless you tell people that you're going to listen to them, and you're going to keep listening to them, and you're interested in representing what they want. The legitimacy of the movement comes from its ability to be able to say, the movement represents the opinions of everybody in the movement. So that means we have to figure out what's bothering people. What are their problems? We have to promise to do something about those problems. We have to delegate action. You can't run a nonviolent movement in a hierarchical form as if it were a military organization. People have to be willing to take responsibility and able to take responsibility for actions in their own locations. All of this represents, from the perspective of how leadership is behaving, humility, not hierarchy. Not leaders giving orders, leaders asking people to do things. Leaders winning people's collaboration by giving them a reasonable argument. And it builds solidarity. I have a stake in this. These people are representing me. I'm a part of this. It's not the heroism of a vanguard, which then takes power and exercises that power by itself. People feel like they have made this change themselves. But it doesn't happen, as failed or long-running unsuccessful movements and campaigns find out, if a movement isn't able to exhibit resilience, which is to say, can it last? Can it survive repression? Can it survive setbacks? Can it stay in the field? This picture right here is of the famous African-American civil rights leader, Fannie Lou Hamer, who ran voter registration drives in Mississippi in the 1960s. And the Reverend James Lawson, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, with whom I was once discussing this idea of resilience, mentioned her and some of his friends, and he said, one of the reasons these movements succeed, I'm convinced, is because each person in a movement, not just the leaders, but especially the leaders, come to the conclusion that if they stay involved in the movement will succeed. And if they don't stay involved in the movement will fail. They come to literally believe that that the success of the movement is contingent on their continued involvement and participation. And then they model and exhibit that to other people. And then that spirit begins to be represented by the collective behavior and will of people in the campaign and movement. These are existential stakes. You're identifying with the cause. You have faith in the eventual success of the movement. This is the social psychology of mobilization and of resilience, if you want to use social science terms, for what is really a very human phenomenon, a constructive, collective human phenomenon that is aroused and employed to create political and social change. It's also force. Let's not make any mistake about it. We're not talking about conflict resolution. We're talking about prosecuting a conflict to the point of victory, winning. This is about winning. This isn't about settling unless you are able to arrive at a settlement in which the other side gives you what you want because you have raised the stakes of the conflict. They want you to demobilize. You have to get something in exchange for demobilizing. But it is definitely about applying force so that you ultimately may be successful in creating such doubts among those who compose the existing group of policyholders, power holders, that they decide some of them decide to cross the line. There'll be disputes, there'll be difficulties, there'll be disagreements within the existing structure, and that structure may ultimately split. A lot of transitions occur because of that. And finally, it's about transformation. The society itself changes when all these emergent properties begin to be evident in the changed society. Some of the signs of that transformation is the realization that people have toward the end that the other side, the opponent, the regime, if it's a regime, the government, the corporation, whatever the oppressive instrument is, that this is not a monolith that they face. These are other people who are making decisions and calculations about their future. This is a political process. There's no such thing as a monolithic enemy. Group polarization and ultimately violent strife within open societies occurs because of the myth that develops that the other side is a monolithic enemy. As we saw, this also changes how you do political change from something destructive in which one side doesn't just lose temporarily for 4 years, but has to be destroyed, to debate It makes everyone a stakeholder in the process. I own this new society in part because I've helped to change it. And it also models, finally, something that's unbelievably important in order to be able to maintain peaceful civil societies. And that is that the kind of society that we wish to produce should be reflected in the means we use to produce that society, or boil down to the popular essence of the idea, we have to be the change we want to see, which is to say we must act consistently with what we say we want the society to be. That wins support because it has credibility. If consistent people are people you can count on, people whose word you can trust. So if you say, well, we want to produce a peaceful society, but we're going to first do it through a violent revolution, there's an inconsistency there. Historically, that has happened almost not at all, but that's a more complex question, which I don't have time to get into right now. But all of this starts with a decision. It starts with understanding what the individual does to begin this process of ensuring that resistance can change everything. And Václav Havel, probably the single most important writer about nonviolent action after Gandhi, in this particular book called Disturbing the Peace, which title I like, of course, because it always jars the people who come to our subject from the perspective of traditional nonviolence, because we say in order to do successful nonviolent action, you have to disturb the peace. You have to do something that's going to bother people initially in order to get to the dynamic by which change occurs. He said, by breaking the rules of the game, the dissident, the first person who joins a campaign or movement, or starts a campaign or movement, that first person disrupts the game, the existing game, the setup in the society. He shatters the world of appearances. He shows everyone that it's possible to live within the truth. We're not going to accept the lies that society is working just fine. We have to tell the truth about society. Living within the lie, if a society is based on a lie that the setup is benefiting everybody, that can constitute the system functionally, he means, only if it's universal, only if everybody is sort of like accepting the lie. Which is why totalitarian regimes have to arrest the first dissident, because they can't afford any truth tellers in the society to be loose and having contact with other people. So he concludes there are no terms whatsoever on which that system can coexist with living in the truth, and therefore everyone who steps out of line denies it in principle and threatens it in its entirety. The severity of repression is proportionate to the existential threat that the regime feels to its hold on power. So the question, therefore, for every individual has to do with really something that is innate to their own identity. The question to each person who might join a nonviolent campaign or movement is, who am I? Who am I? Am I the object of a ruling elite? Is that who I want to be? Is that how I want to live the rest of my life? As the object of a ruling elite, a plaything? Somebody who helps somebody else to get rich? Submissive to threats of violence? I'll go along, I'll play the game of the ruling elite because they're threatening me with arrest otherwise? Or just the social anesthesia that seems to inhibit action in a modern society? Plenty of sports to watch on television. Or, am I a citizen? What an amazing idea. Am I actually a citizen? Able to resist the lie that injustice can't be opposed. Every violent oppressor says to those whom they are oppressing, don't take risks, you won't succeed. Save your life. This is the uncoded, what the message is. You can't resist, it's impossible. Resistance is impossible. But that's not true, as the history shows, as we've seen. And so I'm actually able to develop, if I'm a citizen, the nonviolent means to obtain power or to produce power that's being governed on my own behalf. And the context in which this is used today are really quite extraordinary. There are campaigns and movements against corruption, against social violence, which takes people's rights away just as much as authoritarian political control, for different kinds of group rights, for women's rights, for land reform, for indigenous peoples' rights. Still campaigns for self-rule in places like West Papua and West Sahara and Tibet, for democracy. There's still pro-democratic movements afoot in the world, probably a dozen countries, in Iran and in Egypt. In all of these countries, in most of these struggles, there is still an argument for political violence. The only way that we can take power, the only way we can get rid of this dictator is by shooting our way to power. There are two components to that argument for political violence when you boil it all down. One is that violence is necessary as a means to an end. Quotation which embodies this: oppression cannot be demolished except in a hail of bullets. So naturally that would be said by someone who favors the use of the most extreme form of violence. And the other argument for it is that it's actually a good thing. Violence is a purgative. We'll get rid of all these horrible, terrible, social and economic structures and institutions which are poisoning, our people. We'll be able to just burn them up in a bonfire, of the old regime's vanities. It might even be a way to go to heaven. So the extreme formulation of that, I thought this quote was great. Death is truth, according to Osama bin Laden. Death is truth, meaning that if you have to die, it's okay, because you're actually embodying a form of truth. You're telling the truth by agreeing to die. When I heard that expression, I was reminded of something that Sergej Popovich, one of the leaders of Otpor, one of the groups part of the civic coalition which removed Slobodan Milosevic from power in 2000, what he said when he was asked the question, why did people just sort of hate this old regime so much? And he was going on and on about it, and finally he said this. He said, their language smelled like death. See the connection between that and what bin Laden said? Bin Laden trying to recommend death as a methodology of achieving power, and Serbs deciding that everything the regime said, just like it was dying, like the language reeked of a culture of death, effectively, rather than a culture of life. Contrast that to what this Iranian woman protester said in this interview last year. She said, we're not terrorists, that's what our government has become. Tell the world how much we love life. We just want to be free. This affirmation of life is an instinctive reaction, I think, in the social psychology of campaigns and movements for political liberation. It's a reaction to what this Serbian leader said, that the old regime, all of its rhetoric, all of its discourse, it just had a sense of decay about it. It had not only had it stopped resonating with people, not only was it living within the lie, to use Havel's phrase, it actually exhibited something that was based on the idea of finite choices, finite possibilities, and instead the promise of a democratic society in its theoretical state is that possibilities are not finite, and that decisions that you can make for your own life can be successful decisions, but you have to have the freedom in which to be able to make those decisions. That's instinctively something that's associated with life, and so these movements that have cultural resonance typically find ways to exhibit in such fabulous color and vividness the life which is bursting within the society to be uninhibited by some existing system of control. And when movements tap into that, and that's displayed openly, it becomes irresistible to the rest of the civilian population. And it also becomes irresistible to people who are within the existing system of power, because then they realize this is the society, and I'm being paid to oppose these people. I don't think I want to do that. And a surprising number of them reach that decision, and then they demobilize, usually silently. They go away. It's not that they decide not to shoot in a dramatic instance. They're sick one day when they're called for police duty because there's a demonstration, or all the kids are homesick. Sorry, we can't come in today to help the boys in the force. If there's one story like that, there are 50,000 stories like that. in the last 50 years in all these various campaigns and movements. There's still a demand for militants in the world, and so the task of those of us who are promoting the use and the adoption of civil resistance want to address, and we are addressing people who have an attachment to the idea of militant resistance, but we're trying to detach them. They may be attached to militants, that's not bad, but we want to detach them from the idea that violence is the only form of militant action proportionate to the abuses they want to overcome. That there is another type of force that is proportionate to the abuses and the crimes that have to be overcome. And the comparison between violent and nonviolent power is very interesting. This has been reduced to social science data. In 26% of cases in a 106-year period of time, violent campaigns could be said to have been successful in accomplishing something politically or socially. But nonviolent campaigns were successful in some important phase in 53% of their cases, more than double the successful results. So the record does support why this form of resistance has to be channeled. If your interest is in getting rid of violence, this is a way to do it, in my judgment. The appeal of violence will go down as people find another way to overcome their grievances in the existing system. This captures the whole thing. This was on one single sign in South Africa in 1986 by a woman protester who in her own handwriting just wrote, "To end violence, struggle for justice." In this case, she meant the repressive violence of the state rather than the social violence of traffickers or of guerrillas in the hills. But she said she's saying essentially to create a civil society, you must engage in a struggle for justice, because a society won't be civil unless it's just. It won't be democratic unless it benefits everyone. And that struggle, therefore, is the way to remake, that kind of struggle is the way to remake societies.
This is the beauty of having an online space for our class. If you don't get to ask your question or you don't formulate your comment until a day, until 24 hours later, you can share that question or comment. We'll make a forum for that on our e-classroom, and then if Jack has time, he can come in and respond to those questions that they don't get asked tonight. So take 15 minutes, and you can open up to the floor, Jack.
Yes.
Two observations, if I may, going back to the macro, micro, and the people, and you seem to link the people directly to macro, which is well and good. Once you appear in a square, you are against the authority. But to get to the square, actually, is what is called in your own book, planning, organization, structure,
yes.
and everything.
Yes.
So it is not that everyone in the morning gets up and says,
No, I guess I meant in the totality of the effect of what people together can do. It produces effects which are at the macro level once one stands back from the process of change, and you can get a sense of the scale of what's possible.
Yeah, but in social science, the institutions do play a very, very important role, in terms of.
Well, we tend to operate in an interdisciplinary way, so we're always breaking down walls between perspectives, and we're in that sense we sort of are natural dissidents. We're intellectual dissidents in order to be able to help real dissidents. But I take your point.
With your comparison between Tiananmen Square and Poland,
Yes.
from my point of view, there are at least three fundamental differences, actually. And there are more, but at least in the way that you presented. Poland, there was an external government that was involved, at least very, very visibly Russia. The Soviet Union controlled it, in certain ways. In the case of China, it was a nationalist power. Number two, I think the quality and the quantity of information and support that went to Poland is vastly different from what went into China.
You're talking about something that you're talking about, and that's I'll interrupt you.
In terms of success and failures.
Right. Well, they were in a position to have learned more about what they were doing.
Yeah.
Yes. No question about that. I think that when someone who does an assessment of an unsuccessful nonviolent movement or campaign identifies conditions that may be different in that society from other societies where there was a successful campaign, the conclusion that it's appropriate to draw is not necessarily that the mere presence of those conditions prevented a successful campaign. The real question is, what else could a civilian-based movement or campaign have done to respond to those conditions? Which is to say, and by the way, the debate about whether conditions can trump skills or skills can overcome conditions, I should have actually put skills and conditions down as yet a fourth layer in that other chart. We'll have available for you, I don't know if we have that today, a number of articles, one of which is in the syllabus or Moodle for the course, an article that my colleague Peter Ackerman did for an Oxford presentation about 3 years ago that he calls skills versus conditions, trying to get people to see that structural conditions are not built with concrete, as it were, historical concrete. The presence of difficult conditions should prompt people not to give up, but to carefully evaluate what strategies and tactics might be available, at least initially, to begin to challenge those conditions. The way I put this in my non-academic way is to try to suggest to people that to the greatest extent possible, they stop trying to think of conflicts between governments and popular movements or between any kind of oppressor and any kind of dissident as something that is physical or material, and begin to initially think about this simply as something that is political, social, economic, psychological, and simply at the level of human behavior, and begin to assess what their possibilities might be in the context of those kinds of phenomena, so that because those who want to maintain arbitrary power in a fixed position benefit from a physical and material definition of what is going on from an analytical perspective. There is a certain sense in which a authoritarian power exists in a Newtonian universe and people power exists in a quantum universe. Something different fundamentally is going on. So but we're really talking about analytical frames in order to come to some better understanding of what's been released, into a public space or a civic space by the exercise of civil resistance.
Yeah. Very interesting introduction, first of all, I want to say. I really enjoyed it. And I have a question with regards to, you mentioned economic model for civil resistance. I would really ask you to elaborate a little bit on this. How would this work?
There is a video on our website based on a presentation that Hardy Merriman, one of our senior advisors, and I gave at our Fletcher Summer Institute this year, called Costs and Risks in Nonviolent Conflict. And we called it that rather than the economics of civil resistance, because first of all, we're not economists, so we didn't want to be criticized for talking about economics when we're not economists, but also because we don't think the economics of civil resistance has been well developed as a field of understanding yet. So we thought, let's just talk about costs. Let's talk about how we can think about the costs that a movement can impose on its adversary, an oppressive system, and the costs that the movement might have to bear by taking certain action. So there is a risk that a movement will pay a cost, such as repression, if they engage in certain kinds of nonviolent action. By the same token, by engaging in certain kinds of nonviolent action, it may be possible to impose a real economic cost on the government. Take South Africa, for example. Labor strikes, best example. Boycotts, another good example of nonviolent actions, which in terms of what the individual consumer is doing, don't represent economic action, but have an economic effect on activity from which an oppressive system may derive revenue. So when these kinds of tactics, which can be iterative and cumulative in the life of a movement, end up imposing some kind of economic cost on a system, then that ought to be able to be quantified. And that's what I meant. How one would go about modeling and developing quantitative data about the imposition of costs and the absorption of costs by a movement or a campaign, that work hasn't ever been done. That's completely terra incognita, except insofar as those of us who've studied the subject have intuitions and good guesses about what's going on using that analytical perspective in a campaign or movement. Our sense is that movements and campaigns can be understood from an economic standpoint, or at least from the standpoint of an investment model, which is to say, maybe that's a better way of looking at it, because people are being asked to invest a great deal in many ways through participation in a campaign or movement. What is the likelihood that they will have a return on the risk they take by participation in that movement? My colleague Peter Ackerman, who has a background in finance, is able to actually model this through by adapting some of the traditional diagrams used in financial investment. It'll be interesting to see when we're able to devote sufficient support to research on this, what we come up with. I think by another 5 to 10 years, whoever is standing behind this podium will have a much richer answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I want to thank you for the insights regarding the historical and theoretical perspectives of civil resistance. As somebody who has been involved in a lot of civil resistance movements in my country, and that's the reason why I'm here. I fled my country because I was arrested a number of times and detained and tortured. I want to say that civil resistance has got a lot of challenges, especially in Africa. And I wanted to ask you what you envisage to be the future of civil resistance, as a means of change. My experience in Africa is that the success of this movement depends partly on the resilience of the actors in the process.
Totally.
And I'm speaking this out of experience from my country, where I come from. What do you predict to be the future of this movement? Do you think civil resistance alone per se can be sustained to change the status quo, or it can act, or it can work hand in hand with other things?
Well, I don't believe that. Look, I'm a universalist when it comes to expectations of possible application of civil resistance. I don't think that there are geographic, ethnic, cultural circumstances which make it more difficult in one place in the world than another place in the world. There have been many locally successful campaigns in Africa. There have been phases of larger campaigns that have been intermittently successful. And then there has been the one great success in South Africa, which was produced in the context of a society which was at that point somewhat more well developed than other societies in Africa, which actually afforded interesting opportunities to the anti-apartheid movement, particularly on the economic side. But your emphasis on resilience is absolutely right and absolutely crucial. And I would add to it another question about struggles in Africa, and that's a challenge to movements that happens in a lot of different contexts, certainly not at all special to Africa. And that's the challenge of developing a movement that relies on participation of ordinary people represents ordinary people and isn't and is able to act and evolve as a campaign or a movement without being stereotyped as traditional political opposition. And I'll speak for just a moment now about Zimbabwe. There have been a number of civic groups that have been organized on a national basis in Zimbabwe, which have been very successful in many of the specific nonviolent campaigns that they've undertaken. The one that I'm most familiar with is Women of Zimbabwe Arise, because a few years ago we were partly responsible for a number of workshops in strategic nonviolent action which they went through, some WOZA participants went through. And so we continue to be in touch with them. And not only did they say that resilience was their greatest problem and that was tied to illiteracy, they noted that the literate members of their organization tended to be more resilient than the illiterate members. And the reason that they felt that was true is they said learning the subject gave people who were learning it from reading about it as well as looking at videos more confidence that it would work in the long run. That just only watching the videos, and only getting oral stories and narratives somehow left them in a state over the long run which was less confidence. We've not looked into that, from an educational psychological perspective, but was a very interesting, and one of the key leaders of that organization was the person who told me that a couple of years ago. And she said they had not figured it out, but they had the continued problem that they would have to continue to remobilize it. They'd lose half of their people every couple of years because they understood intellectually that it was going to take many years potentially for this movement to be successful, but they had to deal with this demobilization of people who would lose heart or would just lose patience. So that's a problem. But let me go back to the other question that I mentioned, and it's also illustrated in Zimbabwe. There was always tension between these national civic groups, which had managed to become mass membership organizations. And it acquired the ability to organize many different kinds of nonviolent tactics, while the MDC hadn't acquired that ability and didn't know how to mobilize people, even though it was the sitting traditional opposition party. So the people in the MDC leaders would be coming to the socially based civic groups and say, would you help us organize a demo? Because they'd never acquired the ability to do that. And yet by associating themselves with the MDC, they were in effect opening themselves up to propaganda from the government that they were just part of the same old traditional political, because in Africa and in many other parts of the world, it's certainly by no means restricted to Africa, traditional political opposition parties, which may never achieve power, may nevertheless still be corrupt. In fact, they may be paid off to be ineffective in certain societies. And if you're going to be a civic group that's really representing the people as a whole, you absolutely cannot be corrupt, because people will know that. And then you won't have any legitimacy at all. So the predicament of being tarnished by association with traditional political opposition parties, or being labeled as just wanting power, for its own sake, particularly if there are frequent changes of power have been historically in a society, represents another, what you might call political positioning and identification and communications problem for campaigns and movements. Most of the movements that I've been talking about were movements that were coalitional in nature. They represented diverse kinds of people within the society. Even if there wasn't ethnic diversity, as in Poland, there was still social diversity and professional diversity and geographical diversity, class diversity. But most movements have to become diverse in their membership in order to be able to suggest that they represent everybody. And strictly ethnically based groups have a lot more difficulty doing that if there is more than one ethnicity within the society. So But you know, I think that some of the problems that seem to come up in the life of resistance campaigns and movements in Africa have come up elsewhere as well. It's just a question of being able to, I think, organize learning in such a way that it's easier for people who are beginning to lead these movements to acquire the right background and understanding so that they can be in a better position to succeed, and including learning how to be resilient.
We have time for one more quick question.
Oh, two. Both these. I'll let both these folks. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. My question was about legitimacy and consent.
Yeah.
And like you said, you can withdraw consent and that will make the system illegitimate. But what if there's a role being played by outside actors that are conferring legitimacy on the system? So I think of two examples from the Middle East, where in Egypt you have the struggle for democracy, and yet there's, and that seems like there's a withdrawal to consent happening through the movement. But then you have US aid that's kind of conferring legitimacy on, the continuation of the regime. And you can say the same for the struggle against occupation in Palestine, where there is that, attempt to withdraw consent and delegitimize the system. And then there's also US aid that's kind of conferring into the system and allowing the system to continue.
Well, I think the question is whether or not, the question always is, what do the people believe? What do they believe? Not only about legitimacy, but about prospects for success by following a particular path of resistance. So I'm well familiar with the Palestinian struggle. We've done lots of workshops there. We did one, in fact, last week in Palestine, and Maciej was there, although Maciej's left now. My view is that if you can't do anything about the external actor, it's best not to worry about the external actor. It's best to do what you can do given the space that you have and the resources, particularly the people that you have available potentially to draw into participation in the movement, and to look for ways to aggravate the cost being paid to maintain the existing state of affairs. That's what a lot of Palestinians have found ways to do in recent years through nonviolent resistance. We helped support this new film, Budris, and are now helping to get it translated into Arabic. In fact, we're paying for the Arabic translation. So that, because we think it models one particular campaign that has a lot of classic features in the use of civil resistance. Too much can be made of any one campaign, obviously. You can't, I think it would be a mistake to make the people involved in that campaign into heroes and then try to say you can just replicate that heroism all over the face of the map. But nevertheless, they managed to learn a lot of interesting things about what they were able to accomplish by assessing what they were doing and then improving their practice as they went on. And they did that without respect to whether or not some legitimacy was supposedly accruing to Israel because there was X billion dollars a year going of American aid to Israel. I do think that sometimes overemphasis on the inhibiting effects of an external actor supporting your opponent can psychologically discourage a campaign or movement from even doing the necessary work on itself that it needs to do. There are, why can we? It's hopeless because of X. Sometimes that even inhibits. Wałęsa in Poland, in all the interviews he's done since then, and most of the interviews he's done since then, have said, people say, why didn't you do X or Y during the solidarity phase? And he'll say, because, we had 100,000 Soviet troops on Polish soil, or 50,000, 150, or whatever that number's gone back and forth. So we always had to be concerned that if we did something in a sense, he would say, if we were too successful, if we rubbed Jaruzelski's nose in the dirt, the Soviets would think, they've gone too far, and they'll troops will be in the streets and it'll all be over. So we have to proceed by inches. We can't take big leaps here because of that external actor. He actually used that in a crafty way to be able to inhibit his own militants. His militants would be saying, we must ask for free elections immediately. You know, and he would say, that's nuts, because if we actually did that, the repression would happen a lot quicker, as indeed it would have. He saw the relationship between the threat they were posing. They didn't want to pose too much of a political threat initially in his view, so he was breaking his own movement a lot of the time. And therefore he was using the fact of the external actor to try to break his militants instead of, you know, because Poles weren't saying, well, we can't do anything, because their limit had been reached. They had gone past the existential moment. Workers certainly had. And the ruling party was called the Polish Workers' Party. And they didn't have the support of any workers. It was a tremendous legitimacy problem. So, you know, there was more political space in which, in a sense, in which to mobilize because of those particular circumstances. There are many signs of using, often those who want to make excuses for past episodes of violent insurrectionary activity, or want to make a continuing excuse for a violent struggle, will be the ones who will be exaggerating the importance of the external actor, because they'll want to say this nonviolent stuff will never have an effect. Sami Awad once, in a meeting a few years ago, said to me, you know, I run into a Hamas guy every month, and he says to me, you're still in the nonviolence thing? He laughs. He said, that's a ridiculous. Don't you understand the Israelis only understand violence? He said, I wish I had a quick answer to that. And I said, I'll give you a quick answer to that. Next time somebody says that to you, you should say, exactly. The Israelis understand violence so well, maybe we should try something else, rather than something they understand so well. But I mean, a flip answer on a certain level, but at least changes the conversation back to an assessment of how effective we are in our choice of action. So I don't see it as insuperable. I see it as yet another problem that has to be broken down and assessed from the perspective of what might be possible to do. But you had your...
Well, given the time, we have...
This guy is a
yeah,
tyrant.
I saw it.
He's not going to let us...
No. I want to respect the 8 o'clock stop time for a variety of reasons.
Fine. Yeah, so I'll ask it all.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. I was like, I ask you to lead by example and post your question or your comment online so we can continue the conversation in that space. And Dominic and I want to take a quick moment to kind of set up your assignment leading up to next Tuesday's class. So there's a couple materials that we'll want you to pick up on your way out. We've got 3 books, Unarmed Insurrections, which is by Kurt Schock, one of our academic advisors. Nonviolent Social Movements, A Geographical Perspective, which is an edited volume also put together by some of our academic advisors. And then, of course, A Force More Powerful. So some of your reading assignments from today's class are going to come from some of these books. So please pick those up and take them with you on your way out. And each of you will also get a copy of the A Force More Powerful documentary. And your assignment for the latter half of the week on Thursday is to actually watch one of the segments from this documentary and then engage in an online group discussion with some of your groups here, which Dominic has been putting together. So we want to show you online how to access those group discussions.
Darren, did you designate which one you want?
No.
Okay. No. Do you want everybody to pick?
Yeah, so there are 6 segments in this documentary, and there are 3 that we'd like you to choose to pick from. We're not going to tell you individually which one to watch. It's kind of up to you. You can watch all of them if you want, but you're only required to watch one. And then based off of what you watch and what group you've been assigned to, you're asked to answer a specific question.
So just a tag team. Everybody on this side of the room, you're in group 1. And everyone in the back of the room. Bala, you're in group 1, just so you know. And everybody back here, including Roya, is that how you say your name? You're in group 2, and I'll be back here and you're in group 3. So when you log in, can you back it up one? So you notice on the assignment for 2, you're going to watch. This is a real short video. It's about 5 minutes, and then the assignment's written in here. It's going to tell you every group is assigned a different question. So, and as you're walking out the door, agree upon 5 or 6 of you which movie you're going to watch, or you can talk about it online, because everyone's going to choose the same video to watch, and then next time we meet together, you're going to give a short presentation, 5-10 minutes, on answering the question about your specific case. And okay, can you click this? And if you look here, it says small group discussion of force more powerful. You're going to click that. It's going to bring you to here. And up in the upper left, all participants, you're going to click your group. So group 1, you're going to choose group 1 here, and then you're going to click add into discussion. That's how you will communicate with one another. It's only for the people in your group that you will be talking with. You won't be talking with everyone else, only with your group. If you decide you want to chat with each other live, you say, we're going to meet at Thursday at 6 o'clock and we want to chat live back and forth. We have the capabilities to do that. Just send me an email and I will set up a chat room for you. Otherwise, you're in a discussion room. Does everyone know the difference between a discussion forum and a chat room? If not, email me.
So I wanted to clarify something. Actually, you're not all required to watch the same segment in your group. I think the idea is that if there are 6 people in the group and 2 of you watch the one on Chile, 2 of you watch the one on South Africa, and 2 of you watch the one on India, you want to be able to kind of compare your experiences watching those different segments and how all those different movements from history relate to the question that your group has been asked to respond to.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
But you still be required to give a presentation on the question to answer to the group.
Exactly. And you'll have time next Tuesday's class to meet as a group to get your presentation, or we're not just going to kind of throw you right in there on next Tuesday's class. Okay, any questions? Okay, hearing none, I will say thank you for coming, being part of this class, and we will...
Did you want to show them the form to give you feedback?
Oh, right, and then the last thing, sorry, thank you, Dominic. The last thing, as I said at the beginning, after each class, within 24 hours following each class, we want you to post your reflections on the session on the eClassroom. So for example, today we had Module 1, Conceptual and Historical Foundations of Civil Resistance. If you click on Session Reflections, it asks you to share your reflections. And the first question is, what ideas, concepts, or perspectives from Jack's presentation or from the comments from the participants did you find particularly interesting? Or you're like, well, I never thought about it that way, or this is something new that I learned. And then the second question is, given the presentation, the goals of the class that we outlined, and the diversity of participants that we've gotten to know via your bios online and the human bingo, what do you individually hope to achieve over the next 8 weeks? Because this is important for us to know, because we want to make sure that we're kind of in tune with what it is that you want to get out of this class. So do that within the next 24 hours.
Did you want to show them we set up a forum to ask Jack questions as well?
And then last, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question or share your comment, just click on Questions for Jack DuVall, and then add a new discussion topic, and you can type it in there, and then Jack, when he's got time, will respond to those in kind. Right? Okay, great.
Will that function also be open for responses from others?
Yes, the forum is open. Exactly. So Jack can respond, but also if other people have insights and say, well, here's my perspective, or here's another thing I'd like to add. It's an open forum, so the discussion can go in a multitude of directions. Great. Thank you. Don't forget to grab your books and your DVDs on the way out.